If you've been arrested for drunk driving, the first call you need to make is to attorney Ted Morgan. You can't afford to go it alone. You need to know your rights. You need someone with the experience to put your DUI behind you. 7 days a week, 24 hours a day. Call 706-317-5733. Ask for Ted.
Call Ted Morgan Law when you need a lifeline.
Hello and welcome back to DUI Law, Real Talk with Ted Morgan. Ted is a seasoned trial attorney who has spent the last 30 years defending drivers in DUI and criminal cases in Georgia. I'm Lisa Mosby, and in today's episode, we're talking about what actually happens after a DUI arrest in Georgia, from the moment of the stop through your first courtroom appearance. Welcome back to the show, Ted.
Hey, Lisa, it's great to be back.
You know, Ted, when someone is arrested for DUI in Georgia, what does that first stretch of time look like from the stop itself through being released?
Well, typically, every county I go to, in Georgia and Alabama, the jail has a preset bail for a DUI. So if it's DUI and speeding or some other traffic offense, then the bail's preset. So once the officer puts you in the back of the car, takes you to the jail, it varies on how long it takes the jail to process you. But because the bail is preset, you don't need to wait for a preliminary hearing, which could be the next day. And so the jail knows the amount. You usually have access to a telephone there at the jail. Or if sometimes my clients, they had somebody with them in the car, and that person goes to a bonding company locally. And again, anywhere in the state of Georgia, the bonding company has access to what's called jail view typically. And so they can see you in the system. They know what your charges are, and they know if the bail is preset, if it's available. And so then the bonding company can write the bond. Alternatively, in Georgia, and I think most anywhere now, there's usually a 1-800 number on the wall, and you can call that number and do what's called a cash bond. And that's a little different because you're paying the full amount of the bail, and you're going to get most of that money back. But that's you paying it on maybe your debit card. Versus a bonding company posting the bond. You just pay them a bond premium. But that time frame can vary. If the jail's busy, it takes longer. But that's the process typically.
And then, Ted, once someone is out of custody, what are the next steps that start happening in their case?
You get out of jail, and you're probably in a state of shock. And you're very worried, very stressed, a lot of folks. And so what's happening behind the scenes, and generally I'll say, is that, your case is hardly exist at this point. The jail has the citations. It's usually run by the jail in any county in Georgia is run by the sheriff's department. And so they literally take those citations and the what we refer to as the arrest report that the officer should have filled out, should have made some written report, and they collect that information. And once they know, again, if you processed out of jail on a preset bail, you're not even there anymore. Once they know that, usually the case then goes to some other court, depending on the size of the county. It goes to either a probate court or what's called state court in Georgia. And so it's just a paper file or a digital file being transferred to the court that is ultimately going to adjudicate your case.
And then how does the administrative side, like the license issues, start to unfold separately from the criminal case?
So that's a whole other animal, but it's a very important one because it is typically running at a much faster pace for the simple reason that, again, in Georgia, it's 30 days. If when you were arrested for DUI, you were given what's called a Form 1205, no matter what the reason was for the officer giving you that form, you've got 30 days to take some sort of action. And when you hire a lawyer prior to that 30-day window, which you definitely need to do, then that lawyer can take action for you. We handle that. It's part of the same fee that we charge for the whole case. It's folded in there, and but that one runs pretty quick because if you don't do anything in 30 days, it's a very strict deadline. Usually that means if you missed it, that you're definitely suspended, and nothing's been adjudicated on the actual DUI at that point. And so it's can be very crucial that you get on out and get some help on that, and I would add, not try to navigate that on your own, because it's probably as more confusing than going to court can be sometimes on your first appearance, you know.
Ted, when does the court process begin? How does someone usually find out when their first court date is?
Most everywhere you go, again, when the jail processes your file, the sheriff's department, they send it to whatever court is applicable in that county. If it's a smaller county, it's going to be your probate court in Georgia. In Alabama, it might be the district court. If it's a larger county, sometimes it'll be the municipal court. That depends on sometimes who arrested you, I think. But otherwise, it's going to the state court in Georgia if it's a large county. And so what's happening is that eventually they will send you in the mail. It's there's nothing digital about your first notice most everywhere you go in Georgia. So you'll get a written notice from the court saying State versus John Doe, and you must appear in court. And what's good to know there, Lisa, is that some folks have a driver's license that is not their current address. And if the officer didn't ask or didn't get your current address, then what's on the citation is what's in the court's file, which is a bad address. And they're not responsible for finding out where you live. They're going to send the notice usually to the address that was on your license. And that relates back to another responsibility in most anywhere, any state, is that it's your responsibility to keep that address current with the state agency issuing your driver's license. So it comes back to bite you if that address is bad.
And then what tends to happen during that time between the arrest and the first court date that catches people off guard?
By the time the court date gets to you, your administrative process is probably already running, okay? Because, like I say, 30 days. And I think what is interesting sometimes is that some courts take a lot longer to call the case than others. But the process is the same. It's just a matter of the speed that it takes the court to process you. Sometimes what we see a lot in DUIs is if you submitted to a blood draw, when the prosecutor's arm gets your case from the sheriff's department, I've been saying it transfers to the court. It transfers to the court, but it also really transfers to the prosecutor as well for that court. And so if they see a blood draw, they know that takes a little bit of time. So they won't schedule the arraignment as quickly in those cases. But it's too hard to say that it happens in any particular amount of time. It varies all over how quick that will be. Usually 90 days or less.
And then what's typically happening on the state side during that time after the arrest?
Well, they're preparing their paperwork. Again, typically you've got either a solicitor's office in Georgia in the larger counties, or sometimes the district attorney's office. They will staff, say, the probate court if that's where your case is. Then in municipalities, they have maybe just someone who prosecutes in that court. That's their job, or that's their part-time job. And so they're preparing paperwork. They have to draw up for misdemeanor. A DUI is misdemeanor unless it's your 4th and 10 in Georgia. Then they're drawing up what's called an accusation. Some courts, they file just the uniform traffic citation you receive, and that becomes the accusation. Some recent case law is making that practice kind of problematic. But at any rate, that's what they're doing, is they're preparing a written accusation that is filed with the clerk of the court. And then, of course, like I say, the clerk is really responsible for it, but ultimately you get a notice from the clerk or from the office of the court, whatever that is, saying, hey, you've got a court date.
And I know, Ted, from your perspective, you've seen, everything that runs the gamut on how people respond to these cases. Where do people start to make decisions during this early phase that can affect the outcome of how the case plays out?
Well, it probably isn't going to be real shocking. Those who procrastinate, sometimes they wait longer than the 30 days. And if they received this Form 1205, like I say, that is an administrative case to suspend your license because of something the officer says happened when he arrested you. And so the folks who procrastinate and let that date go, it's not good. But yeah, we see it all over. Some folks wait until they receive the notice from the court, and we'll get a call and they'll say, hey, I got court Friday. Typically we can handle it, but sometimes if we're really busy, I can't even be in court that date. And so you see it all across the board. Different folks, they may live out of state, and it just takes them longer to figure out how to find an attorney where they were actually arrested if they're out of state. So, but that's a all across the board kind of response there.
But does the timeline ever change at all based on the specifics of the arrest or maybe the complexity of the case?
Well, the initial timelines won't change any. The court's going to process that case pretty much like they would. Now, if you had, let's say there's a DUI arrest and you hurt somebody, serious bodily injury or death to the other driver or pedestrian, those cases, you might not see the accusation and the actual arraignment of the case that quickly. They have 2 years in Georgia to do all that. But I would say it's very rare that I see it getting anywhere near 2 years. It's usually within a couple of months at most. So sometimes, yeah, cases that have more serious charges, they take a little bit more time, and sometimes it's actually the office of the arresting officer, say Georgia State Troopers, that if there's a death, then they do a much more extensive investigation into the scene of the incident, and so naturally, compiling that information might delay how soon the state and the prosecutor decides what are they going to charge you with.
Ted, you mentioned that sometimes people are from out of state when they get arrested and they need to find an attorney. Can they go through this case and all of its proceedings from a distance, or do they need to actually appear back again in Georgia? Can you walk us through that if we're from an out of state situation?
Well, the old lawyer response, it depends, but it really does, because some courts are more how to say this, they're not as formal about the appearance. Sometimes we can keep them from having to show up for the initial appearance because that typically is just your arraignment, and arraignment can be waived. And so most any court that we go to, if we waive arraignment in writing, then the client, neither one of us has to appear. It's somewhat of a formality. And most any court is going to excuse you from that. But, eventually, you're probably going to have to appear in that court. We've had some success because of where we are. Fort Benning, Fort Moore is right here at Columbus. So when there are soldiers or other folks who have come through Columbus, come through Fort Moore, and then they're PCS'd out somewhere else by the time the charge comes around, sometimes we can help with them not having to come back. That depends a lot on the case, though. Sometimes if it's really straightforward, we can do a written plea, but that requires that some other things are done that sometimes the defendant just isn't able to do that quickly. So yeah, general rule, you're going to have to come back eventually.
Interesting. And then when someone finally does get to the first court date after the arraignment, what actually is happening in the courtroom at that stage?
If you're speaking of the initial court date, the one we can waive, not much, but eventually, just depends on the court. Sometimes they just want to see your face and get a status. They want you to stand up and say, we're trying to work it out with the prosecutor to come up with what we call a negotiated plea. Or, hey, are we still waiting on information from the prosecutor, or what's going on? Sometimes you already know, hey, Judge, we're just going to have to find a date and time for a trial in this case. We can't work it out, or we know we're not going to work it out. But those are the kind of conversations you're typically having. Some courts are a little more structured than that, and they have your it might be just a calendar call, but they basically say, okay, well, you've got a certain amount of time to have your motions heard, and otherwise you're going to be set down for trial next month. Some courts just run their dockets a little faster, so it can vary from court to court.
Ted, let's wrap up this episode with some final thoughts from you to someone who might be going through this, experiencing this situation right now. What advice do you have for them?
Well, it sounds self-serving, but I say it anyway. You know, Google is great. ChatGPT is great, as far as giving you some information about what you're up against, as far as just the legalities, maybe what you're charged with. You can definitely learn a lot online about what is generally going on. But in the end, Google can't go to court. ChatGPT can't go to court with you or for you. And my advice is just don't outsmart yourself and think that you can assimilate all that and figure out how this judge is going to deal with your case, how this prosecutor is going to deal with this case, what are the real intricacies. And so just get a lawyer, get a good DUI lawyer, and you'll understand in the end that was a great decision.
Thank you so much for your insight and your guidance today. This was very valuable. And folks, thank you for listening to DUI Law Real Talk. If you or someone you know has been arrested for a DUI in Georgia and you're trying to understand what happens next, visit tedmorganlaw.com to schedule a consultation with Ted. And don't forget to like, leave a review, and subscribe so you don't miss the upcoming episodes. Thank you so much for listening. We'll see you next time.
Thanks for watching. Be sure to hit that like and subscribe button and leave us a review in the comments.